Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the organizers Article 19 Student RSF for the invitation. For the last 8 years, I was editor of a newspaper in northern Mexico, one of the cities that was most affected by the drug war, the fight among the cartels, and in a span of 4 years, the newspaper where I worked was the target of 5 armed attacks by organized crime groups, and in one instance, the kidnapping of 5 workers as very novel and very forceful form of intimidation. And the cases taken together, I think, sort of highlight the inadequacy of measures that had been undertaken by the Mexican government in terms of mechanisms for protecting journalists, and also highlights the need of media companies to develop and take the initiative in crafting protection measures and protection mechanisms. The first 2 armed attacks against the newspapers were one in 2009 and the other one in 2011, were met with complete impunity by the authorities. There was no investigation, and of course there was no prosecution because there was no arrests. And we came really to the conclusion that the impunity that was enjoyed by the criminals in those 2 cases became the basis for the second, the next and most aggressive attack against the newspaper, which came in February of 2013, when 5 non-editorial workers that weren't even journalists were kidnapped as a way to send a message to tone down the coverage that we have been having of violence in the city. And then that was followed by 3 episodes of armed attacks against the newspaper. The difference between that, the case in 2013 and the previous cases was that the 2013 cases happened after the Mexican government put in place protection mechanism for journalists, after the Mexican government instituted a special prosecutor in the federal attorney general's office, and after, and as it was crafting a law to federalize crimes against journalists, attacks against journalists, but also the difference between the attacks in 2013 and the ones before was that even with those mechanisms in place, those attacks were solved, were actually punished despite the mechanisms, and completely aside from the mechanism and the special prosecutor was never involved in that. So even as it was in place, even as it was functioning, or supposedly functioning, it really didn't have anything to do with the fact that those attacks were punished. After the kidnappings and the armed attacks in 2013, there was an initiative by federal authorities, notably the Army and the federal police, and by the local government in the state of Coahuila, to go after the criminal cell that had been responsible for those attacks, relying on investigations by the federal police and on intelligence gathered by the Army and the local police forces, and they actually managed to arrest about 40 people connected with that criminal group. But the irony of the whole thing was that the protection mechanism didn't have anything to do with that. Actually, after the kidnappings, it took 3 days for the people in the office of the mechanism to actually get in touch with us, to see what we needed. After 3 days after the fact. So I think that the something that I want to speak of today is how those protection mechanisms can be in place, they can be on paper, and they can really look good on paper, but when applied to reality, they are proved inadequate. And in the case of Mexico, I think it has to do with the fact that the protection mechanism is very abstract, is very vague, and it can address only a tiny percentage of cases, because the types of attacks against journalists in Mexico are so diverse, and there are so many different kinds of them that the protection mechanism cannot address them all. For example, the mechanism is invoked whenever a journalist is threatened. Journalist is threatened, he can call the mechanism and get protection. But the problem is that most of the attacks against journalists in Mexico happen without prior threat. Nobody threatened the newspaper when the criminal groups went in and shot the offices, or when they kidnapped the workers. So there was really no way to invoke the mechanism at that point. In another case, for example, the mechanism talks about protecting individual journalists. But what happens when an entire news organization is attacked, which has a legal impact, it has a psychological impact, because every worker sort of suffers the attack in person, and there is really no way to protect the 500 employees that a media company can have at some point. So there is really a dissonance between reality and the tools that are used to face that reality. The February of this year killing of Gregorio Jimenez, a reporter in Veracruz, was the perfect example of a crime that should have been attracted by the Federal Attorney General's office under the new laws that federalized attacks against journalists. But after the reporter was kidnapped, and 6 days later his body was found, even after that happened, the Federal Attorney General's office was still evaluating whether the crime had had anything to do with his journalistic work. So the law was there. The law said that attacks against journalists had to be federalized, but there really was no implementation of the law at that point. And I think that this sheds light on an incapacity to set international standards. Because the problem sometimes, I think, is that these protection mechanisms do not take into account the realities on the ground. As far as I know, when the previous legislature in Mexico was developing the protection mechanism from journalists, there was no consultation with journalists. So nobody picked up the phone and asked editors or reporters saying, how are you being attacked? What kind of aggressions are you being subject of? There was no consultation, so there was no diagnostic. There was no diagnostic, and so the result was sort of imperfect. What I found in my experience is that we came to rely on sort of like our own protection mechanism, which is, on one hand, develop editorial guidelines, develop security protocols inside the newsrooms where the reporters are involved, the editors are involved, the owners are involved, and investing in some of those protection measures. And then on the other hand, develop lines of communication with authorities so that if they're local authorities, so that if there is a problem, in our case, we were being attacked by a non-state actor, by organized crime. In case there was a problem, there was an open line of communication to federal police commanders, army commanders, high-level functionaries in the state government or the federal government, people that we could rely on in order to expose our problem and say, we were being threatened or we're being attacked, and then they would take the initiative and actually do something about it, which was it really made a difference in that case. I mean, I think that in some cases there might be political will, and there has proven to be political will by the government to address this problem, but the tools that are being used are imperfect, and they are proved inadequate. And whenever even the question of political will actually varies from place to place. You can have government in one place willing to step up to the problem and try to solve the problem and fight those who are attacking journalists, and then you can have governments in other parts of the country who really don't care about the issue. So there's a difference in the way that these things are working in Mexico. There is really not a one-size-fits-all solution. We cannot design a protection mechanism in Mexico that would cover everyone, because there are very different scenarios to consider, and the risks are changing constantly, and in places it's different. In Veracruz, for example, the state of Veracruz, the most common form of aggression for journalists to journalists is homicide. In the state of Tamaulipas, the most common form is attacking the offices of news organizations. So different realities on the ground cannot have a recipe that covers them all, and I think there has been a lack of discussion as to how to fill in those gaps that we are seeing. If bureaucrats are designing the mechanism, is going to be a recipe for failure. But journalists have not really gotten involved as a whole in trying to evaluate the risks, assess the situation locally, and then trying to also to come up with ideas and generate proposals that might help mitigate the risks. And there are a lot of reports out there. Article 19, Freedom House, the rapporteur, they all put out reports, but they are not being analyzed in terms of getting a diagnostic and say what is the most effective way to prevent attacks on journalists in northern Mexico, for example. The way we're going to know that is we're going to look at what are the most frequent types of aggressions to journalists in northern Mexico, which are different from the ones in southern Mexico, for example. And that might be this year, because next year the situation might be completely different. So there really needs to be a constant evaluation of the threat, and I think that that is really the main point that I would try to get across in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you